Mail-in ballots, because I think that was one of the ones that got the more votes, right?
Yes, it was. Mail-in ballots was so to another topic of political fraud and corruption in our modern day and age. So there's different rules in different places, and the key issues with mail-in balloting that's different than absentee balloting is with absentee balloting we have these safeguards built into the political process. So the first safeguard is you have to request that ballot and you have to meet certain standards in the way your request is done. Sometimes it has to be notarized, sometimes it has to be witnessed, sometimes you have to provide certain information that only you would know. But basically, the first safeguard is that you request that ballot before it is sent to you. And then secondly, there can be certain safeguards built into that in terms of who can proving that you in fact requested it. The second safeguard is that someone notarizes it, someone witnesses it, and then the third safeguard is it is returned in time to be counted. Those three safeguards are being removed at various levels in what Trump calls mail-in balloting. So when Trump says mail-in balloting, he means where the state just sends ballots to anyone who's ever been registered to vote in the state, regardless of whether they, not even checking the list about whether they're active or inactive in some contexts, whether they've moved, whether they've died, things of this nature. And that's the biggest objection. The second objection is the method by which that ballot is returned. In some contexts, they allow what's called ballot harvesting. So in other words, rather than you delivering it to the election offices or you delivering it to the postman, someone can go around and gather it, and gather a bunch of ballots and all produce them at the same time. That's the second area of controversy, the method of delivery of the ballot. And then the third is the timing. So the question is, do you have to return the ballot by election day, or can it be returned weeks after election day and still be counted, as long as it was quote unquote postmarked by a certain day? And then you get into postmarking standards, and making sure the postmark is actually being monitored. And so those are the different issues with it's when the ballot is returned, by what means the ballot is returned, and by what means you get the ballot in the first place. Those are the three areas of legal controversy that now there are federal lawsuits brought by President Trump's campaign in Pennsylvania, in Virginia, not Virginia, Pennsylvania, I think partially Michigan, Montana, Nevada. And they have a good argument. They put together some good key talking points about the risk of that mail-in balloting clearly poses a higher risk of ballot fraud than does absentee balloting. The concern is that people could get more ballots than they could be entitled to. In other words, when someone has to request it and meet certain standards to be able to even get it in the first place, far fewer ballots go out. Whereas like Nevada had hundreds of thousands of ballots returned that were sent to people that didn't live there. And those were the ones that were undeliverable. What about people who got like at apartment buildings? You'd see, a whole tray of ballots. Someone could just grab them and fill them out and sign them and send them back in. What's to stop it? How do you prevent it? So the risk for fraud goes up as the safeguards go down. And so the argument Trump is making is a multiple argument. One is that there's voter dilution is going to occur because voter fraud risk is higher due to a lot of these methodological issues. The second argument is that any ballot returned after election day can't be counted because that violates the one election day rule, which is mandated by the federal statutes that election day can only happen on or has to happen by a particular day. And so those are the two main constitutional and statutory arguments they're making. They're saying equal protection due process violation because there's voter dilution, because voter fraud dilutes the effectiveness of the vote of those people who did not participate in the fraud. And that goes to all the issues about where ballots are being sent, how many are being sent, when they're being sent, who can gather them, where they're being sent back, risk of coercion. Because, nobody's with you when you walk into the ballot box. Whereas you could have 10 people around you when you're signing your absentee ballot, and they could make sure you did it, quote unquote, the right way. So there's coercion risk. There's bribery risk. Hey, $50 if you sign this ballot and you've marked who I want you to mark here. So all of those risks go sky high and that's why you have a notary present. Like the obligation of a notary present is the notary's there to say no one else was there. They weren't under any pressure. No one else got to see who they voted for, so on and so forth. By removing those safeguards, they've created constitutional voter dilution issues by their heightened risk of voter fraud. And so the two grounds are they're allowing ballots to be counted after election day. That violates I think that's the strongest, easiest claim for them to prevail on. The second is voter dilution due to the nature of mail-in balloting.
I just don't understand. First thing, I don't understand now the argument for it, considering Dr. Fauci says voting in person is fine. There's ways to do it safely, easily. So I don't know where the pressing concern for this reform is. I guess the other question is, I mean, it is reform. It's not. This has not been done prior to this election, right? I mean, the early voting is one thing, but at bulk mailing out ballots has not been done before.
Not in most, very few states. So Colorado does a version of it, and California has been doing a version of it since 2016. So so California allows ballot harvesting. So like this is where it got on Republican radar. Was on 2018. It looked like Republicans were going to hold a bunch of House seats in California, and on election night. And then a week later, all of a sudden, a whole bunch of ballots come in, and Democrats flip all those seats. That's when they realized this was a massive operation of a different scale than they anticipated. And it's very hard to prove voter fraud. You can show unusual tendencies and whatnot, but it's just very tough to prove. And in fact, mail-in balloting is the easiest and most effective way to do it. Both Attorney General Barr and all of these lawsuits keep citing the study done in 2009. That was a bipartisan commission that included James Baker and President Jimmy Carter that said mail-in balloting posed the greatest risk of voter fraud to America's elections. So there are a few places that have allowed it. Oregon has a form of mail-in balloting. There are states that generally don't have a high history of voter fraud. And they still have certain safeguards in place that are not fully in place in some of these other states like Nevada. So I agree. The theory is the easier you make voting, the better. I agree with that, but I think there's ways to do that that are consistent with both privacy and security of the election. I think we should use blockchain type technologies that allow that to occur, so you could still have privacy, still have security, but still have ease of voting. But it's no doubt that there's a reason why almost only Democrats are pushing for this, and it's not because of COVID. In Nevada, they're real blunt about it. In Nevada, they did have open for election day. They're going to have places you can vote. It's just in Democratic precincts for the most part. The rural Republican areas got no voting places you could even vote if you wanted to. So I mean, it was just one big power grab. That's what I think it really is. I understand a lot of the people on the left, on the electoral legal side, would say, look, this is about maximizing participation. That's what democracy is all about. Mail-in balloting will achieve it. Connecticut, at least Colorado and Oregon have had success with minimal allegation of fraud concerning it. So that should be our priority focus. But the COVID itself is not really grounds at all to have this mass mail-in balloting campaign.
Now, as far as it goes, I understand it's not entirely feasible if you want to vote early to go get a notary to witness, an early or an absentee. What is it, an absentee vote? An early vote. But I don't see how you can avoid problems. This is again, I come from Canada, where when I want to vote in municipal elections, 2 pieces of ID and a proof of address. So the idea of not having voter ID as a starter is foreign to me. And I don't how many countries in the world do not have voter ID laws? I think US and there's one other, right?
Yeah, very, very few. I remember in this, I was in England a couple of years ago, and we was on a bar tour, a great pub tour. But as part of it, there was a guy there from India, and then there was this lefty guy that was sort of leading the guide, and he was talking about how America's so corrupt because they were going to try to require voter ID. And the guy from India was like, "Hold on a second, you have elections you can vote without voter ID?" And he didn't expect this from a liberal guy from India. The lefty, it was a lefty from Canada, actually.
I remember this. I remember the incident.
So it was classic. So given the whole nature of it, I think there's here. I am sympathetic with the idea of maximizing voter participation entirely. I think we can make voting much easier than we do. I like the way they originally did it in Nevada. Nevada, when you'd vote on this computerized system, but they would give you your receipt, so you get to keep it, which I like that. I like some method of receipt if you need to. But it concerned me that, but this invites fraud and invites litigation, which is, I think, unless Trump wins by a solid margin or Biden wins by a solid margin, and by that I mean 2 points or more in more than 270 electoral votes, we are going to have Bush v. Gore on steroids come election day.
Yeah. No. And incidentally, corruption aside, fraud aside, sorry, I didn't mean to bring up that. The issue of the coercion is something that I don't think most people are thinking about. Like, your grandmother or your mother getting, or your grandfather, your father, like an older person getting a ballot, and someone comes to their house and says, "Hey, we saw that video on Twitter of the L.A. Lady going to visit her Iowa family, or Ohio, I forget which, going to try to convince them not to vote Trump." Well, for someone who's easily not even manipulated, but over whom a younger person exercises control, there's no telling what can happen once you get behind the ballot box, and it's only you in that box, but you got to put it in an envelope.
And between husbands and wives, like if my ex-fiance was around, I guarantee you I wouldn't be doing any mail-in balloting, because it was only going to have to go one direction, or I would have been out on the street. So God bless her. So and there's that dynamic with a lot of people. So because these days politics is religion, particularly for some people on the left, it's the substitute for religion. So I think there's problems with the way Democrats have rushed this. I think it looks bad. I think if you were truly wanting a little de-democratic process, you would have come to agreements with both parties, found ways to make it easier to vote without and accommodate anybody's COVID concerns without creating massive fraud exposure.
Okay, and I'm going to bring this up because I get to practice, or I get to show off my French. The Patriote canadien Maine says, Viva frère, j'aime ton émission. Question, pourquoi s'ils savent que c'est anticonstitutionnel, meilleur mot dans Scrabble, de voter par mail, ils laissent aller ça. So, I love your show. Question, if they know it's unconstitutional, best word in Scrabble, to vote by mail, why do they still insist on doing it?
Well, they think it's legal. For them, this is about maximizing. In fact, they think it's illegal not to require it. There's actually lawsuits along those lines. Their view is voter participation. Their perspective is this. The Democratic perspective, and a lot of your election legal scholars that lean left, would say this is just Republicans trying to suppress the vote because an honest election would throw them out of office. That's how they see it. They see it as a long history of trying to suppress black voters, suppress immigrant voters, suppress poor voters, poll taxes in the South, things like that. And so they see any obstacle not as about avoiding voter fraud, which they claim is a myth and doesn't exist in any meaningful manner. They're not credible when they do that, by the way. I've been trying to tell my left-leaning friends on this side of the aisle that don't make that pitch. There's so much history of voter fraud. It goes way back. It happens every election somewhere, someplace. It's only about whether they get caught. But that's their perspective. And so that's they see this as constitutional, and that a real democracy would make it extremely easy for everybody to vote. That you should be able to do like drive-through vote balloting, mail-in balloting, email balloting, phone balloting, you name it.
I know the joke that Trump made that he got in trouble for, mail in and then try to go vote in person and see if they still have you down. Knowing how there's lag, knowing there's confusion, knowing that you might get two ballots to two different addresses with the same name and they go to two different stations. It's so not preposterous to think they would, how many people are not just going to go try to vote a second time and see if they get caught? Oh, you get turned back. Good. If you don't do it enough, and you can make some headway. It's not. Everything's been so politicized that the suggestion that this might be a flaw in the system is now being politicized, but it's just common sense that there are lags, there are miscommunications, and it's inevitable. So if enough people go try to test the system, enough might get through to have an impact.
Yeah, no doubt about it. So it's a major risk. I hope Trump is getting all the lawyers lined up, because if he doesn't win by 2 points or more in enough states, the lawsuits are flying. And Hillary Clinton came out yesterday or the day before. There's that great video with her and Bill.
With Bill Clinton in the background.
That's going to be permanently memeable. It's classic Bill. He couldn't hide his why am I here? Why can't I get away?
I try not. I try. I don't generally partake. I do not partake in making fun of those types of things, but my goodness, Jack Posobiec was going nuts with it. James Woods was going nuts with it. They were memeing it, and yeah, it was. There was one where they were playing "Hello, Darkness, My Old Friend" and just slowly zooming into Bill Clinton's face. Okay.
To that super chat, real briefly, by the way, the super chat about whether it goes to Congress, the way it's not a majority House vote. It's you vote by state delegation. So Trump would likely win that. So throwing the race into the House will not help the Democrats. They need to win it outside of the House. But what Hillary said, by the way, was she said that Biden should not accept the results of the election and should not on election night. And so that means they're planning on massive litigation.
No, and this coming from, and CNN is saying the same thing. What happens if Trump refuses to accept the results of the election? It's pathological projection. It's pathological projection. And I think it's even worse. I think it is a dog whistle to get people ready to get up on arms if they don't win. And talking about the political permission slip, that's how I view it, and that's how I interpret it.
And it was very important for Democrats that they won the governorships of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin in 2018. So it means those states, you have big Democratic cities, Milwaukee, Detroit, and Philadelphia, and Democratic governors controlling the state election machinery. So the shenanigan risk is going to be unusually high. It's going to look like 1960, where Nixon had to go quietly into the good night, even though they were still counting ballots from dead people early in the morning.
All right, now I want to bring up one super chat, which I can't bring up. I'm just going to read it. Well, I'm going to bring this one down. Zombie. Okay, why can't Trump and the DOJ already start suing states to stop this mail-in ballot nonsense? If we can stand in line at a store wearing a mask, how can we not stand in line to vote?
So the Trump campaign has. The Justice Department considers it beyond the scope of their issues to deal with.
Okay,
it's another area where Barr is not particularly helpful.